Imagine being born into the loudest band in the world and somehow still feeling unheard. That was Julian Lennon. His first cry came in the early morning of April 8, 1963, just as his father's band, the Beatles, was beginning to rewrite music history. But John wasn't there. He was on stage somewhere else, guitar in hand, chasing fame while his wife Cynthia was in a hospital bed, bringing their son into a world that already had other priorities. From the start, Julian wasn't really a baby in his father's eyes. He was a reminder of a time before success, before Yoko, before enlightenment. John once joked to a therapist that fatherhood at 22 was his biggest mistake. It sounds cruel, but the truth is, he didn't know how to love someone who needed him more than the world did. By the time Julian was 2, he could recognize his father's voice on the radio more easily than in person. He'd wait by the window every evening, tiny fingers gripping the sill, hoping the next car that passed might bring his dad home. Most nights, it didn't. Even as a baby, he was famous not because he'd done anything, but because of who his father was. His face appeared in magazines, his baby blanket spread on studio floors while cameras clicked around him. John barely looked at him during those shoots, his mind already somewhere else. Cynthia tried to protect Julian's privacy, but the court said no. Minors have no rights to their own image, they told her. And so, Julian became public property before he even knew what the word meant. But maybe the cruelest truth was hidden in John's own handwriting sketchbooks, filled with cartoons of Julian, little doodles of a boy his father could draw but not hold. He spent more time with those drawings than with the real child. One sketch showed Julian as a grown man holding a syringe drawn years before drugs would swallow John himself. Just dark humor, he'd said when Cynthia found them. But maybe, in a way, he was confessing to something he couldn't yet face. Then came Yoko. She was everything John believed art was supposed to be: bold, different, unflinching. Their love story began with a hammer and a nail, a small art piece that cracked open an entire marriage. Cynthia found notes, late-night phone calls, and then one morning an empty bed. "I've found my soulmate," John said. That's all. No apology, no explanation. Just a replacement. Julian was 4 when he visited his father on the set of Magical Mystery Tour. Ringo Starr gave him candy and drumsticks, keeping him company while John spent most of the time on the phone with Yoko. 17 calls in 2 days. At one point, a camera went flying across the room and it missed Julian's head by inches. Years later, he said Ringo was more of a father that week than John had ever been. One of the most famous Beatles songs came from a child's crayon drawing. Julian brought home a picture from school, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. But when the world asked where the title came from, John leaned into the LSD rumors, pretending his son's imagination had nothing to do with it. Julian found out the truth from a magazine years later. Imagine learning your father's love song to your art was actually just another myth. The divorce that followed was brutal. John told lawyers that Julian wasn't really his son, just biology. He said it enough times that people started to believe it. When Julian turned 6, John sent him a telegram from a hotel bed in Montreal. "Happy birthday, Jules. Sorry, busy with peace. No call, no visit. Just an apology wrapped in irony." Cynthia said Julian cried for 3 days. Years later, when John was asked about his sons, he said something that still echoes in interviews and family records, that Julian was a Saturday night mistake. But Sean, his son with Yoko, was planned, wanted, and loved from conception. Julian was 17 when he read that. It shattered him. How could you forgive a man for something like that, especially when the whole world worshipped him? But Julian tried. Music became his way of speaking back to the silence. In 1981, he started recording demos on a cheap 4-track setup at home. A producer heard something in his voice. A haunting familiarity, but also pain, the kind that doesn't need a name. 2 years later, Julian was in the same kind of studio his father once ruled, recording his debut album, Vallata. It wasn't just an album. It was a conversation with a ghost. He poured everything into those songs. Grief, loneliness, hope, the kind that only someone who's lived in the shadow of a giant could understand. When the album came out in 1984, it exploded. The single Too Late for Goodbyes climbed the charts, and the music video filled with old home footage played on MTV over 40 times that month. The same footage Yoko had tried to bury under legal threats. For the first time, Julian reclaimed his own story, using the very memories she'd tried to erase. The critics called his voice hauntingly similar to John's. Fans called him the second coming. But Julian didn't want to be a reflection. He wanted to be real. When Madonna accused him of coasting on his father's fame, he snapped. Security had to pull them apart backstage at the Grammys. Maybe that moment said everything. Julian wasn't chasing his father's ghost anymore. He was fighting to exist beyond it. The years that followed were heavy with the same weight of tabloids, expectations, the Lennon name. He toured, lost his voice, canceled shows, and still, people wanted Beatles songs. He gave them his own instead, and they didn't always listen. But he kept writing. Because that's what you do when the world only sees your surname. You tell your story anyway. And maybe the saddest chapter came years later, when Julian discovered Yoko had lost millions from the estate in bad investments, money she refused to share, though she'd built her fortune on his father's name, too. That was the moment Julian stopped hoping for peace. He said he'd forgiven John long ago, but Yoko? Never. Because forgiveness isn't about moving on, it's about being seen. And for Julian, that never really happened. Today, when he speaks about his father, there's no anger in his voice. Just a kind of quiet understanding that some love stories are meant to break you before they teach you anything. He still writes music, still searches for light in the shadow, because maybe that's what it means to be John Lennon's son, to learn that even when the world calls your father a hero, you're the one left holding the silence he left behind. By the time the 1980s began to fade, Julian Lennon had already lived several lifetimes. Fame had wrapped around him like an echo he never asked for. He could sell out shows, shake hands with legends, but still wake up feeling like the world was looking past him, listening for his father's ghost in his voice. Music had always been his way of breathing. But by 1987, the air had gotten thin. He had money, success, headlines, just never for the right reasons. Reporters cared more about who he was dating than what he was creating. Every melody he wrote seemed to come with a shadow of someone else's song. The constant comparisons, the gossip, the pressure, it all burned him out. Slowly, he began to disappear from the spotlight. When he returned with Mr. Jordan in 1989, it was supposed to be a rebirth. Eric Clapton played on some tracks. The production was slick, expensive, almost too perfect. Critics said it lacked heart, but they didn't know the heart behind it was exhausted. The album barely cracked the charts in America, and the losses were brutal. Then came the crash, literally. March 1990, Pacific Coast Highway, his Ferrari hit a barrier at 70 miles an hour. Broken ribs, a fractured arm, and a reminder that even when the world calls you lucky, it doesn't mean you're safe. While he healed, he wrote a song for his mother, You're the One, born from the fear of losing her to cancer. It didn't chart high, but it carried something more important: truth. And maybe that's what his music had been missing all along, the space to feel without being judged by a last name. A year later, Virgin Records offered him a second chance. $1 million advance, creative freedom, and a new start. Help Yourself came with Saltwater, an aching, beautiful anthem about the planet dying in silence. The video showed real footage of dead dolphins. The label donated its profits to the World Wildlife Fund. It wasn't just another pop single, it was a plea. When Julian sang, "We're all made of water," it felt like he was trying to wash away everything that came before. The song exploded in Australia, hit the top 10 in the UK, and for a moment, the world seemed to finally hear him for who he was. But peace never stayed long. Protesters showed up at his shows accusing him of cashing in on his father's name. In Chicago, he stopped mid-song and gave a 10-minute speech, raw, unscripted, dedicating Rebel King to John. MTV caught it, and it spread everywhere. The irony was sharp. The moment he stopped defending himself was the one that made people listen again. By the mid-90s, he'd had enough of the industry's cage. Virgin wanted another radio hit. Julian wanted jazz, experimentation, something honest. They clashed. Deadlines slipped. He started drinking heavily vodka for breakfast, regret for dinner. A crash in Monaco, an arrest, rehab. When he got sober, he found himself staring at the kind of silence fame can't fill. And then came the old wounds, money, legacy, betrayal. John's will had left Julian almost nothing. A $250,000 trust, while Sean inherited a fortune. Not a cent from Hey Jude, not even from John's solo tracks that used Julian's voice from childhood tapes. So he sued. Twice. Years of courtrooms, press leaks, letters, and pain. He won settlements millions, yes, but nothing that could ever balance what he'd lost as a son. The fight revealed things most people didn't want to believe. Yoko's failed investments, missing estate funds, taped confessions from John filled with guilt. Julian didn't just inherit a name. He inherited the weight of everyone else's choices, yet from all of that darkness came something almost spiritual. In 1998, on a quiet Australian beach, he found a dead albatross tangled in plastic. It broke him open. That moment became the seed for the White Feather Foundation, named after something John had once told him. "If I ever die, I'll send you a white feather to let you know I'm okay." Years later, in Adelaide, an Aboriginal elder had handed him one. It felt like a message from the other side, a father's peace, finally delivered. Julian turned that symbol into purpose. He traveled the world: Ethiopia with charity, water, Kenya with the UN, South America with the Kogi people using his lens instead of his voice. His photography became a diary of compassion, a way to see rather than be seen. The profits from his 2007 documentary Whale Dreamers went back to the indigenous communities it honored. The foundation stayed small, focused, personal proof that legacy could mean something different. When his childhood friend Lucy, the one from Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, fell ill, he was there for her. After she passed, he wrote a song in her name and gave the proceeds to lupus charities. For the first time, the name Lennon didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a bridge between pain and peace. Through the 2000s, photography became his voice. His exhibitions in New York, Los Angeles, and Miami captured faces, landscapes, and fragile moments of hope. Every frame was a love letter to the world his father once sang about but never got to heal. Still, music had its way of finding him again. In 2011, he returned with Everything Changes soft, reflective, more human than ever. He called it his favorite album. No gimmicks, no pressure, just stories. The song Someday, with Steven Tyler, carried a line that nodded to Baby, "You're a rich man." But this time it was about wealth of spirit, not fame. When the world went quiet during the pandemic, Julian picked up his guitar again. He found old tapes, unfinished demos, tiny pieces of the person he used to be. And out of them came Jude, released on September 9th, 2022. The title said everything. A full-circle moment. The little boy Paul McCartney once sang to was now answering back. The album bled honesty, grief, forgiveness, peace. He cried when he heard it finished. It was closure, but not in the Hollywood way. Just the quiet kind you earn after decades of learning how to forgive someone who never asked for it. In 2023, his photography book Life's Fragile Moments was published, a stunning reflection on 2 decades of seeing the world not as a star, but as a witness. And then came something no one expected. His Love the Earth children's series, adapted from his Touch the Earth books, premiered in London in 2025. It wasn't about him at all. It was about teaching kids to care. Deepak Chopra voiced a character. Even King Charles showed up for the launch. And later that year, almost poetically, he released an EP called Because Songs Rescued from Dusty Cassettes, Reimagined for a New World. One track, A New Dream, played like a message to his younger self, that it was never really about outrunning a shadow, but about finding light inside it. Julian Lennon may have been born into one of the loudest legacies in history, but he learned something his father never did, that peace isn't something you preach. It's something you build quietly, piece by piece. And somewhere between the songs, the photos, and the feathers, he finally became what he was always meant to be, not John Lennon's son, but Julian, the man who turned a broken inheritance into a beautiful life.